Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're doing a bit of a clinical consultation. But instead of checking your blood pressure or your heart rate, we're actually going to diagnose your screen fatigue. We are going to explore the profound, scientifically documented physiological and psychological effects of what happens when you just stop using your smartphone. So let's dive right into this, because the way our devices are literally rewiring our brains is absolutely fascinating, and understanding it is the very first step to reclaiming your attention. Okay, I want you to ask yourself this simple diagnostic question right now and be totally honest. Do you feel a genuine knot in your stomach when that little battery icon turns red? Well, if you do, you are definitely not alone. Recent medical survey data shows that a staggering 47% of people experience genuine panic or anxiety when their battery indicator drops below 20%. Just think about that for a second. Nearly half of us are having a visceral, biological stress response simply because a piece of technology is losing its charge. And that brings us to a pretty sobering reality. Medical experts, including Dr. Peter Farvelden, are increasingly comparing our device habits to recognized behavioral addictions, kind of like gambling. This isn't just a bad habit or some lack of willpower on your part. It is a fundamental rewiring of how we seek reward and stimulation. We're essentially carrying around pocket-sized slot machines, and having them constantly accessible has amplified this issue on a massive global scale. So let's define the actual pathology we're looking at here. Digital addiction is a behavioral condition where excessive device use triggers a dopamine release in the brain. You see, your brain naturally strives for an optimal level of mental stimulation, but because smartphones provide immediate, endless, low-effort entertainment, you end up trapped in this cycle of dependence. You reach for the phone to cure a moment of boredom, but it actually creates a cycle of disengagement that lowers your working memory and distracts you from the truly meaningful activities in your life. Which brings us to Section 1, the 72-hour withdrawal syndrome. So what exactly happens when we literally pull the plug? Well, just like any physical dependency, stopping the constant digital stimulation of your smartphone triggers a very real acute biological withdrawal. You can't just toss the phone in a drawer and expect to feel perfectly fine an hour later. The first 3 days are biologically rough. At 24 hours, you're looking at acute psychological distress. Think restlessness and irritability. By 48 hours, your dopamine baseline is desperately trying to figure out how to function without those constant little hits. But by 72 hours, something amazing happens. Scientists conducting fMRI scans have discovered that after just 3 days of restriction, activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, that's the brain region linked to reward and self-control, actually begins to shift and recover. Now, during this withdrawal phase, you might even experience what researchers call the phantom limb effect. You know that weird feeling where you instinctively reach for a device that isn't there, or you feel ghost vibrations buzzing in your empty pocket? This happens because your motor impulses and your neural circuitry have been so deeply conditioned by notifications. Even long-term abstainers report reaching for a non-existent phone months after giving it up. That's just how deeply ingrained this habit is in our physical bodies. Moving right along to Section 2, healing, anxiety, and sleep. Here is the truly incredible news. If you can just push through that initial 72-hour friction, the prognosis for your nervous system, your emotional regulation, and especially your sleep quality is incredibly promising. Let's talk about sleep for a second. A fascinating study out of Georgetown University found that people who partially detoxed from their phones gained an average of 20 extra minutes of highly restorative sleep every single night. Why? Well, because the blue light emitted from our screens suppresses the secretion of melatonin, the hormone that regulates sleep. By stopping screen time, especially right before bed, these folks reclaimed deep REM sleep, which is absolutely essential for your brain to process information and clear out metabolic waste. Now, when it comes to mental health, the impact of a digital detox is absolutely striking. The researchers at Georgetown had participants cut internet access to their phones for 2 weeks, and the reduction in anxiety and depressive symptoms wasn't just a minor bump. As you can see, the improvements were in the exact same ballpark as established clinical treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy, and they were actually larger than the typical effects we see in antidepressant clinical trials. Simply removing that constant digital stimulation radically lowered stress and increased overall life satisfaction. Let's look at Section 3, the smartphone loneliness paradox. To really understand this digital fatigue and why removing it makes us feel so much better, we have to look at the psychological paradox right at the heart of our screen addiction. We reach for our devices seeking a quick dopamine hit of connection, right? But psychology research shows it traps us in a vicious cycle. We engage in perceived connection, superficial interactions, social comparison, and FOMO, but this ultimately leads to actual disconnection. When college students in one study felt unfocused, they reached for their phones for relief, but it just left them feeling more detached, lethargic, and isolated the next day. It literally pulls you away from the shared social norms of the physical world. And the numbers back this up dramatically. Heavy social media users, meaning anyone spending 3 or more hours a day on their platforms, are practically twice as likely to feel lonely or socially isolated compared to moderate or low users. It's a crazy paradox. You're surrounding yourself with thousands of digital voices, yet the biological result is a profound sense of being entirely alone. Which brings us to our final part, Section 4, a doctor's detox prescription. So, consider me your virtual clinician for the day. Let's figure out a sustainable treatment plan. How do we actually achieve digital minimalism without falling completely off the grid? The absolute most crucial point is establishing proper digital hygiene through physical boundaries in your environment. Pediatricians and eye doctors highly recommend enforcing a digital sunset, meaning you stop all recreational screen use 1 to 2 hours before bed. You should also establish strict screen-free zones like the dining room. And always charge your devices outside the bedroom. By physically removing the temptation, you break that unconscious habit of reaching for the screen, allowing your natural melatonin production to finally kick in. Now, if you're someone who has to work on screens all day, you also need to combat digital eye strain and something called accommodation fatigue. That's where your eyes get exhausted from constantly focusing on tiny close-up pixels. You should strictly follow this 3-step 20-20-20 rule. Basically, every 20 minutes, look at an object 20 feet away for 20 seconds. It sounds simple, but when we stare at screens, our blink rate drops by a massive third. This simple rule forces your visual system to reset, redistributes your tear foam, and prevents severe dry eyes and headaches. And the best part? You definitely don't have to throw your smartphone in the trash to see these benefits. The Georgetown study proved that partial detoxes work incredibly well. You can use apps, like Freedom, for example, to temporarily strip away your internet access. This essentially turns your incredibly smart device into a temporary dumb phone that only handles calls and texts. It beautifully breaks the addictive loop of social media and gaming without sacrificing the utility of having a phone for actual emergencies or navigation. I want to wrap up this explainer by leaving you with a really provocative thought from a successful long-term digital abstainer. Limitation is the new liberation. We so often think that having infinite digital choices at our fingertips makes us free. But in reality, by consciously limiting your choices, you actually liberate your mind. You get to reclaim your focus, your creativity, your sleep, and your presence in the physical world. So I'll leave you with this. What would you do with your life if you weren't constantly looking down at a screen? Because that is exactly what you have to look forward to.